She pointed at my pregnant belly and yelled, "That baby will never see a penny." The words cut through the garden party like a siren through silence. My mother-in-law, Lorraine Pembroke, stood beneath the wisteria arbor with her finger aimed at my stomach as if she could erase what grew inside me with sheer contempt. Around us, 24 guests in pastel dresses and linen blazers froze mid-conversation. A waiter balanced a tray of champagne flutes that caught the afternoon sun and held it there, suspended. The fountain behind the rose garden continued its oblivious burbling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My husband Derek reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. I simply stood there, 6 months pregnant in a cream maternity dress I'd chosen specifically because it looked expensive without being showy, and I met her eyes. She thought I was helpless. She thought pregnancy made me weak. What Lorraine didn't know was that in the leather portfolio resting on the hall table inside her manor, I had documents that would reshape her entire understanding of power. But that revelation would come later, after she'd spent every last drop of her venom. I let her keep talking. Sometimes the best strategy is simply letting your opponent empty the chamber before you show them you were never unarmed. That moment under the wisteria became the axis point of everything that followed. But to understand how we arrived there, you need to know where I started, and who I was before Derek Pembroke walked into the municipal courthouse on a rainy Tuesday in March, back when I still believed that working twice as hard would eventually equal belonging. I grew up in Salinas, California, where the field stretched green and endless under a sky that never quite committed to blue. My mother, Isadora, worked the administrative office at a lettuce processing plant. She came home every evening smelling faintly of industrial soap and exhaustion, her hands rough from years of handling paperwork in rooms where the air conditioning never quite reached. My father left when I was 3. I have exactly one memory of him, the sound of his keys jingling as he locked the door from the outside, and my mother standing at the kitchen window with her palms pressed flat against the glass. Isadora raised me on a philosophy of precision. Every dollar was accounted for in a spiral notebook she kept in the drawer beside the stove. Every grade I brought home was examined not for praise but for patterns. "Where did you lose those 3 points, Mija?" Not because she was cruel, but because she understood that girls like us didn't have margins for error. The world measured us with a different ruler, and she wanted me to know the conversion rate by heart. Our apartment was a small 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a complex that always smelled like someone else's dinner. The carpet was brown in a way that suggested it had once been another color and given up. But Isadora kept it clean. She kept everything clean. Order was the only luxury we could afford in abundance. I did my homework at a folding table we'd set up near the window, where the light lasted longest before we had to turn on the lamp we'd bought at a yard sale. On Friday nights, we played cards and ate popcorn made on the stove, and she told me stories about her own mother who had crossed the border with nothing but a canvas bag and a St. Christopher medal that I now wore on a thin gold chain beneath my dress. In school, I learned quickly that being smart was acceptable as long as you weren't smarter than the teacher wanted you to be. I kept my hand down unless called upon. I edited my papers to sound less polished. Intelligence, I discovered, needed to wear camouflage if it wanted to move safely through the world. By high school, I had perfected a particular kind of invisibility. Not the invisibility of neglect, but the strategic kind. The kind that let me collect information while others assumed I wasn't listening. I was good with numbers. Not just competent, but fluent in the way some people are with languages. I could look at a column of figures and see the story they were trying to tell, or more importantly, the story they were trying to hide. Mrs. Kowalski, my 11th grade math teacher, noticed during a unit on statistics when I pointed out that the sample size in our textbook example was too small to support its conclusion. She kept me after class and asked if I'd ever considered accounting. I hadn't. In my world, accounting was something that happened in glass buildings downtown, performed by people whose mothers didn't smell like industrial soap. But Mrs. Kowalski was persistent in that quiet way good teachers are. She helped me apply for scholarships. She drove me to college fairs in her own car on Saturdays. When I got accepted to Portland State University with enough financial aid to make it almost possible, She handed me a check for $500 and told me it was an investment she expected me to repay by becoming exactly who I was capable of being. Portland felt like a different planet. The rain fell softer there, almost apologetic. People drank coffee like it was a ritual instead of just fuel. The university campus had trees that turned colors I'd only seen in pictures. I shared a dorm room with a girl from Lake Oswego whose parents owned a dental practice and a summer house on the coast. She was kind in an accidental way, never quite noticing that the clothes I wore came from thrift stores or that I ate ramen for dinner 4 nights a week. We existed in parallel dimensions, polite and separate. I majored in accounting and minored in criminal justice, a combination that raised eyebrows during advising sessions. But I'd become fascinated by the architecture of financial crime, the way money could be made to disappear or reappear, how paper trails could be erased or forged. White-collar crime felt like a puzzle where every number was both a clue and a potential lie. I wanted to learn how to read between the ledger lines. My mother died during my junior year. A stroke, sudden and complete. She collapsed in the break room at the plant during her afternoon shift. By the time I got the call and made it back to Salinas, she was already gone. The funeral was small. Co-workers from the plant came and said she was reliable, which I suppose was the highest compliment that world offered. I wore the only black dress I owned and held the St. Christopher medal so tightly it left an imprint on my palm. Going through her apartment afterward, I found the spiral notebooks. 15 years of them, stacked neatly in a cardboard box in her closet. Every dollar she'd ever earned or spent, documented in her careful handwriting. On the inside cover of the oldest one, she'd written something in Spanish that translated to, "If you can count it, you can control it." I packed those notebooks in my suitcase and brought them back to Portland, where they sat on my desk like a small shrine to the religion of precision she'd taught me. After graduation, I took a job with a mid-sized firm that specialized in fraud examination. The work was exactly what I'd hoped, puzzles made of money. I traced embezzlement schemes through offshore accounts. I reconstructed financial statements that had been deliberately shredded. I learned that rich people stole just as often as poor people, they just used better letterhead. My supervisor, a man named Glenn Hartwick who wore bow ties and spoke in footnotes, told me I had an instinct for deception. He meant it as a compliment. Within 3 years, I'd built a reputation. Companies called our firm specifically to request me for cases involving complex fraud. I was thorough to the point of obsession. I didn't just find the missing money, I found the story of how it went missing, who helped it disappear, and where it was trying to hide. Numbers, I'd learned, always told the truth eventually. You just had to know how to listen. I lived simply. A 1-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland with good light and no dishwasher. I bought my clothes at outlet stores and my furniture from estate sales. I saved half of every paycheck the way my mother had taught me. On weekends, I volunteered at a nonprofit that helped immigrant families navigate tax preparation. It felt like the least I could do, a small repayment to the world that had let my grandmother across the border with nothing but a canvas bag and a prayer. I wasn't lonely, exactly. I had colleagues I respected and a best friend named Tanya Okafor who worked in the public defender's office and had a laugh that could reset your entire nervous system. We met for Thai food every other Thursday and complained about our jobs in the way people do when they actually love what they do but need to pretend they don't. I dated occasionally, men who were pleasant enough but never quite essential. I told myself I was content. Contentment felt like a reasonable goal for someone who'd started where I had. And then I met Lorraine Pembroke in the waiting area of the Multnomah County Courthouse on a Tuesday in March when the rain was doing that thing it does in Portland where it's not quite falling so much as hovering in the air. I was there to testify in a fraud case. He was there for jury duty. We were both early, a trait we'd later joke about, and the only 2 people in a waiting room designed to hold 50. He was reading a paperback novel, which surprised me. Most people scrolled through their phones in that dead time between arrival and obligation. He looked up when I sat down 3 chairs away, smiled briefly, and went back to his book. We didn't speak for 20 minutes. Then they called his group for selection, and as he stood to leave, he paused and said, "Good luck with whatever brings you here." It was such a small kindness, that wish from a stranger. I found myself smiling for the rest of the morning. I didn't expect to see him again. Portland was big enough to swallow people. But 2 weeks later, I was at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, working on a case file, when someone said, "Courthouse luck must have held." I looked up and there he was, Derek Pembroke, holding a cappuccino and wearing the kind of smile people wear when they're genuinely pleased by an unexpected coincidence. We talked for an hour. He was a landscape architect, which explained the dirt under his fingernails that somehow looked intentional. He designed public parks and green spaces, translated people's ideas about beauty into actual dirt and grass and trees. He talked about plants the way I talked about numbers, like they were a language he'd learned to speak. His family was from Ashford Heights, he mentioned casually, the kind of casual that people use when they're trying not to make a big deal of coming from money. I nodded and didn't ask follow-up questions because I'd learned that people appreciated it when you didn't press them about wealth. We started seeing each other with the kind of gentle momentum that feels inevitable in retrospect. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became weekends. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He took me to a botanical garden and explained the architecture of root systems. I showed him how to spot inconsistencies in a financial statement. He laughed easily and often. He listened like he was actually hearing, not just waiting for his turn to talk. 3 months in, he told me he was falling in love with me while we were sitting on a bench in Riverside Park watching the Willamette River try to decide which direction it wanted to flow. I fell back. Not despite our differences, but maybe because of them. Derek moved through the world with an ease I'd never possessed. Doors opened for him that I hadn't known were doors. But he never made me feel less than. He asked about my work with genuine curiosity. He met Tanya and remembered details from our Thai food conversations. When I told him about my mother, he held my hand and didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes. 6 months into our relationship, he invited me to Sunday dinner at his family's estate. "Just to warn you," he said, "my mother can be intense. She has opinions about everything and isn't shy about sharing them. But my dad is great. You'll like him." I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion and the St. Christopher medal tucked beneath the neckline. I told myself it was just dinner. People had dinner with their boyfriends' parents all the time. It was a normal milestone in normal relationships. The Pembroke estate sat behind iron gates in Ashford Heights, where the houses had names instead of just addresses. Tall hedges. Circular driveways. The kind of manicured lawns that require staff to maintain. Derek's childhood home was a Georgian colonial with columns that made a statement and windows that reflected wealth back at itself. We parked in front, and I felt my stomach tighten in a way it hadn't since my first day of college. Howard Pembroke answered the door himself, which surprised me. He was tall and white-haired with a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. "You must be Vera," he said warmly. "Derek hasn't stopped talking about you since March." He ushered us into an entrance hall with marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire year's salary. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Pembroke staring down with expressions that suggested they'd never doubted their place in the world. Lorraine appeared at the top of the staircase. She descended slowly, deliberately, one hand on the banister like she was making an entrance at a theater. She wore cream linen and pearls. Her hair was that particular shade of blonde that requires maintenance and money. She looked at me the way someone might look at a stain on expensive upholstery, assessment and displeasure happening simultaneously. "So this is Vera," she said, not extending her hand. "Derek has mentioned you." The way she said mentioned made it clear that whatever he'd said, she'd found it insufficient. We moved to the dining room, where a table that could seat 12 was set for 4. Crystal glasses. China plates with gold rims. Cloth napkins folded into shapes that suggested someone had gone to finishing school. Dinner was an interrogation disguised as conversation. Lorraine asked where I grew up, where I went to school, what my parents did. Each answer landed like a stone in water, creating ripples of judgment I could feel but not quite see. When I mentioned my mother had worked at a processing plant, Lorraine's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "How industrious," she said, and took a sip of wine that somehow communicated volumes. Howard tried to redirect, asking about my work. I kept my explanation simple. Forensic accounting, fraud examination, helping companies find financial irregularities. Lorraine perked up at that. "So you chase money," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Derek's hand found mine under the table. I squeezed back to let him know I was fine. I was used to being underestimated. It had been happening my entire life. After dinner, Derek gave me a tour of the grounds while his parents had coffee in the library. The property stretched back for acres. Gardens designed by someone who understood symmetry. A greenhouse filled with orchids. A pool house larger than the apartment I'd grown up in. "I know my mother was cold," Derek said as we walked. "She's protective. She'll warm up once she knows you better." I nodded and didn't tell him what I'd already learned. Lorraine Pembroke had no intention of warming up. I'd seen her expression when I mentioned Salinas. I knew exactly what she thought of me. And I knew that nothing I did would change it. But I loved Derek. That was the complication. He was kind and genuine and saw me as more than just a collection of credentials or deficits. When he proposed 8 months later, a simple question asked while we were hiking in the gorge with no ring because he wanted to pick it out together, I said yes because I meant it. I knew what I was marrying into, but I also knew what I was marrying. There was a difference. The engagement period was tense. Lorraine planned a party to announce it, but every decision became a negotiation. The guest list, the venue, the menu. She had opinions about everything and presented them as facts. Derek tried to mediate, but he'd grown up in that house. He'd learned the same survival techniques I had, just in a different language. Avoiding conflict becomes reflexive when you've practiced it long enough. The wedding itself was elegant and expensive, paid for by the Pembrokes with the understanding that it reflected their family. I wore a dress Lorraine had approved after rejecting my first 3 choices. We married in a church I'd never attended, followed by a reception at the country club where Lorraine served on the board. My side of the aisle was sparse. Tanya, Glenn, a few colleagues, some faces from the nonprofit. Derek's side was packed with generations of Ashford Heights families who all seemed to know each other from various boards and clubs and charitable foundations. During the reception, Lorraine gave a toast that managed to welcome me into the family while simultaneously reminding everyone that I was from outside it. "Derek has always had a heart for people from all walks of life," she said, smiling. The guests laughed politely. I held my champagne glass and understood perfectly what she'd done. It was masterful, really. The kind of social violence that leaves no visible bruise. We honeymooned in Costa Rica, 2 weeks of Derek showing me cloud forests and volcanic beaches. We didn't talk about his mother. It felt like an agreement we'd reached without discussing it. When we returned, we moved into a house Derek had bought in Laurelhurst, a neighborhood that split the difference between his world and mine. It had a garden he could design and an office where I could work from home when cases required it. For a while, life found a rhythm. Derek's firm thrived. My reputation grew. We had dinners with his family once a month, mandatory appearances where Lorraine asked pointed questions about when we might give her grandchildren and made comments about my work schedule. "A career is wonderful," she'd say, "but at some point, priorities have to shift." I smiled and changed the subject. Derek would apologize later, and I'd tell him it was fine, and we'd both pretend we believed it. Then I got pregnant. We hadn't been trying, but we hadn't been preventing it either. Just letting life unfold. When the test showed positive, Derek cried. Happy tears, the kind that make a man's face younger. We told his parents over Sunday dinner. Howard was delighted, already talking about teaching his grandchild to fish. Lorraine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How far along?" she asked. When I said 6 weeks, she nodded slowly. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll see." I didn't understand what she meant by that until later. But I should have. I should have recognized that tone. It was the same one she'd used at my wedding. The sound of a woman who'd already made up her mind and was just waiting for events to confirm her judgment. The pregnancy changed everything, though not in the ways I expected. My body transformed with a precision that felt almost mathematical. Each week brought measurable shifts. The nausea that arrived like clockwork at 7 in the morning and departed by noon. The way my center of gravity adjusted as my belly grew. The strange new heaviness of my breasts. I documented it all in a journal, not out of sentimentality but out of habit. I'd spent my whole life tracking patterns, and this was just another form of data collection. Derek was attentive to the point of comedy. He researched prenatal vitamins like he was writing a dissertation. He downloaded 3 different apps to track the baby's development and would report updates as if I wasn't living them. "The baby is the size of a lime this week," he'd announce over breakfast. I found it endearing, this need of his to understand something that was fundamentally mysterious. He approached impending fatherhood the way he approached landscape design, looking for the underlying structure that would help everything make sense. Work became more complicated. I'd been assigned to a case involving a commercial real estate developer who'd been running an elaborate shell game with investor funds. The numbers were a mess, deliberately tangled, and untangling them required the kind of sustained focus that pregnancy brain made challenging. I'd find myself staring at spreadsheets, losing the thread of logic I'd been following. Glenn noticed and started checking in more frequently, not in a way that felt like surveillance but in the way good mentors do when they see someone struggling. "Take the afternoon," he'd say when he found me rubbing my temples in the conference room. "The numbers will still be lying tomorrow." I appreciated that he never made it about the pregnancy explicitly. Just acknowledged that I was human and humans needed breaks. Still, I worried. I'd built my reputation on being sharper than everyone else in the room. What happened when sharp started to dull? The monthly dinners at the Pembroke estate took on a different tenor once my belly started showing. Lorraine's attention shifted from pointed questions about my career to pointed observations about my body. "You're carrying low," she'd say, as if this were a diagnosis. "My doctor says everything is progressing normally," I'd reply, and she'd smile that wasn't quite a smile. "Doctors don't know everything, dear. I carried 3 children. Experience counts for something." Derek had 2 siblings I hadn't mentioned yet because they orbited the family's solar system at a distance. His older sister Celeste had married a venture capitalist named Preston Drury and now lived in Seattle, appearing at family gatherings with the air of someone completing an obligation. She was polite to me in the way people are polite to their brother's choices, friendly enough but never quite warm. His younger brother Cameron had moved to Denver after college and called on birthdays but rarely visited. The Pembroke family, I'd learned, was held together more by expectation than affection. At 4 months, we had the anatomy scan. Derek held my hand in the dimmed ultrasound room while the technician moved the wand across my belly, calling out measurements and anatomical landmarks. There was the spine, a string of pearls on the grainy screen. The chambers of the heart, opening and closing in rhythm. 4 fingers on the left hand, and yes, there was the thumb. Everything present and accounted for. "Would you like to know the sex?" the technician asked. We looked at each other and said yes at the same time. "It's a boy," she said, and Derek made a sound I'd never heard him make before, something between a laugh and a sob. We named him Julian in the car on the way home, no debate, just immediate agreement. It had been my grandfather's name, the man who'd sent money back to Mexico every month until he died, who'd taught my mother that family was something you built with your actions, not just your blood. Derek loved the name for its sound, the way it felt both classic and underused. "Julian Pembroke," he said, testing it out. "Jules for short." "It's perfect." Lorraine's reaction to the name was less enthusiastic. "Julian," she repeated when we told her over dinner the following Sunday. "That's quite ethnic, isn't it?" Derek's jaw tightened. "It's a Roman name, Mom." "Pretty classic actually." She waved her hand as if erasing the correction. "Well, I suppose it could be worse. You could have chosen something truly outlandish." Howard intervened before Derek could respond, raising his glass in a toast to baby Julian, and the moment passed the way uncomfortable moments do in families that prefer smoothing over to actually resolving. But something had shifted. I saw it in the way Lorraine looked at my belly now, as if it contained not her grandchild but evidence of an invasion. The questions became more intrusive. Was I planning to take maternity leave? How long? What about childcare? Surely I wasn't considering going back to work full-time. Studies show, she'd begin, and then launch into selective statistics about maternal presence and childhood development. I'd nod and take another bite of whatever had been served and let her words slide past me like water past stone. At 5 months, I started planning the baby shower with Tanya, who approached the project with the organized intensity she brought to trial preparation. We decided on a garden party at our house in Laurelhurst. Small, intimate, mostly my friends and Derek's friends, the people who actually cared about us rather than the Ashford Heights social registry. But when Lorraine found out, she insisted on hosting instead. The Pembroke grandchild's shower should be at the family estate, she declared. It's tradition. Derek tried to argue, but I stopped him. Pick your battles, I'd learned. A shower was just a party. Let her have this one. What I didn't anticipate was that letting Lorraine host meant letting her control everything. The guest list expanded to include her friends, her social circle, women I'd never met who belonged to the same clubs and sat on the same charitable boards. Tanya was invited, barely, along with a handful of my colleagues. But they'd be outnumbered 3-1 by Lorraine's world. The invitations went out on cream cardstock with script so elaborate it was almost illegible. Gifts were to be sent to the estate in advance. The dress code was garden formal, whatever that meant. Tanya called me after receiving hers. Garden formal, she said. Is that like business casual but with more judgment? I laughed because the alternative was crying. Just wear something nice and prepare to be inspected, I told her. We'll get through it together. The week before the shower, something happened at work that should have been a warning. I was deep in the real estate developer case, finally starting to see the pattern in the chaos. Money had been moved through a series of LLCs, each one owned by another, a Russian nesting doll of corporate entities designed to obscure the trail. But I'd found the thread. One account that appeared in multiple places, always briefly, always with transfers that happened in the middle of the night when no one was watching. I was running a trace on that account when I got a call from an unknown number. Usually I let those go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Ms. Castellanos, a woman's voice said. This is Patricia Chen from Westridge Financial. I understand you've been looking into some accounts that intersect with our institution. I sat up straighter. Westridge was a private wealth management firm that catered to high net worth clients. Very high net worth. The kind of place where you needed a referral just to open a checking account. I'm conducting a fraud investigation, I said carefully. If Westridge accounts are involved, we should probably set up a formal meeting. There was a pause. Ms. Castellanos, I'm calling as a courtesy. Some of our clients value their privacy enormously. Sometimes investigators find themselves going down paths that lead to complications. Legal complications. I wanted to make sure you were aware of that before proceeding. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't quite not a threat either. I thanked her for the call and hung up, my hands shaking slightly. Then I called Glenn. We need to talk about the Westridge connection, I said. He came to my office immediately, closed the door, and listened while I explained the call. His face went through several expressions before settling on concern. You've stumbled into something bigger than we thought, he said finally. These aren't just investors being defrauded. There's institutional money involved. Old money. Should we back off? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Glenn had taught me that backing off when things got complicated wasn't just bad ethics, it was bad practice. Absolutely not, he said. But we need to be careful. Document everything. Copy me on every file. And Vera, watch your back. People don't make courtesy calls unless they're nervous about what you might find. I spent the next 3 days digging deeper, working late despite Derek's concerns about me overdoing it. The pattern became clearer. The real estate developer wasn't acting alone. He had partners, silent ones, who were using his projects to launder money from sources I couldn't quite identify yet. And one of the shell companies, buried 6 layers deep in the corporate structure, had an address that made me pause. Ashford Heights. The same exclusive suburb where the Pembroke estate sat behind its iron gates. It might have been coincidence. Ashford Heights wasn't that small. Lots of wealthy people lived there. But something in my gut, the same instinct that had made me good at this work, told me to keep pulling that thread. I ran property records for the address. The building was registered to a company called Pembroke Holdings LLC. My hands went cold. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. Pembroke wasn't an uncommon name. This could be completely unrelated to Derek's family. But I knew better. Numbers didn't lie, even when you wanted them to. I pulled the corporate filings for Pembroke Holdings. The registered agent was Howard Pembroke, Derek's father. My father-in-law. I leaned back in my chair and put both hands on my belly, feeling Julian kick as if responding to my stress. This was bad. This was potentially very bad. I couldn't be investigating a case that involved my husband's family. The conflict of interest was massive. But I also couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I called Glenn again. This time I went to his office, closed the door, and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You need to recuse yourself from this case," he said finally. "Immediately. I'll take it over directly." Relief and disappointment hit me simultaneously. Relief because he was right, I couldn't continue. Disappointment because this was my case, my investigation, and I hated leaving it unfinished. "Do you think Howard is involved?" I asked. Glenn chose his words carefully. "I think his name is on paperwork for a company that's part of a potentially criminal enterprise. Whether he knows what that company is being used for is a different question. These things can be complicated. Sometimes people lend their names to ventures without understanding the full scope." It was generous, giving him the benefit of doubt. But I'd seen enough fraud investigations to know that willful ignorance was its own kind of guilt. I didn't tell Derek. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on what Glenn found. It felt like a betrayal, keeping this secret, but telling him felt like a different kind of betrayal. What would I even say? "Your father might be implicated in a money laundering scheme, but don't worry, it might just be that he's careless with where he puts his name." The whole situation sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. The morning of the baby shower arrived with perfect weather, the kind of June day that makes people forget Portland knows how to rain. I dressed carefully in a flowing white dress that accommodated my belly, put on the St. Christopher medal, and told myself it was just a party. A few hours of polite conversation, some gifts for Julian, cake, and then it would be over. Derek drove us to his parents' estate, his hand resting on my knee whenever we stopped at traffic lights. "You look beautiful," he kept saying, as if repetition would make the day easier. The estate had been transformed. White tents on the back lawn. Tables dressed in pale blue linen. Arrangements of hydrangeas and roses that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be. A string quartet played something classical near the fountain. Waiters in white jackets circulated with trays of sparkling water and tiny sandwiches. It looked like a wedding reception, or a scene from a movie about wealthy people having wealthy people problems. Lorraine held court near the entrance to the garden, greeting guests as they arrived. She wore pale yellow and pearls, her hair done in that way that looked effortless but required significant effort. When she saw me, her smile was tight. "Vera, darling, how lovely you look. So maternal." The way she said maternal made it sound like an affliction. She air-kissed near my cheeks, careful not to actually make contact, and then turned to greet the next arrival, an older woman dripping with diamonds who exclaimed about how wonderful everything looked. Tanya found me near the beverage table, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "This is insane," she whispered. "There's a ice sculpture of a stork. An actual ice sculpture. At a baby shower." I squeezed her arm gratefully. Having her there made the whole thing slightly more bearable. We stuck together as much as possible, a two-person island in a sea of Ashford Heights society. Women I didn't know kept approaching to introduce themselves, always with the same pattern. Their name, which charity board they served on, and a question designed to establish my place in the hierarchy. Where did you go to school? What does your family do? And always, the slight pause when I answered, the recalculation happening behind their eyes. The gift opening happened on a small stage Lorraine had set up, complete with 2 chairs arranged like thrones. I sat in one while Derek sat in the other, and guests gathered around in a semicircle. Someone had organized the gifts by size, largest to smallest, creating a visual representation of excess that made me vaguely nauseous. Designer baby clothes still in their boutique boxes. A stroller that cost more than my first car. A handmade cradle from Italy that Howard explained had been in the family for generations, though I'd never heard him mention it before. Lorraine narrated each gift like an auctioneer, reading the card aloud and commenting on the giver's excellent taste or long friendship with the family. When we got to Tanya's gift, a simple but beautiful mobile she'd found at a craft fair, Lorraine held it up briefly and said, "How charming. Handmade." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. I caught Tanya's eye and mouthed thank you, trying to communicate that I loved it, that it mattered more than all the designer nonsense piling up around me. We were nearly through the pile when Lorraine stood up, even though there were still gifts remaining. "Before we continue," she announced, "I'd like to say a few words." The crowd quieted. Derek reached for my hand. Something in Lorraine's posture made my stomach clench. This wasn't going to be a normal grandmother's speech about joy and blessings. This was something else. "Family," Lorraine began, "is the cornerstone of society. The Pembroke family has been a pillar of this community for 4 generations. We take that responsibility seriously." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled guests before landing on me. "Which is why it's so important that we're clear about expectations and boundaries, especially as we welcome new members into our fold." The temperature seemed to drop despite the June sunshine. Derek's hand tightened around mine. "Mom," he started to say, but she held up a hand to silence him. "Derek, please. This needs to be said." She turned back to address the crowd, but her words were aimed at me. "There are standards in this family. Ways of doing things. Values that have been maintained through generations. And while we welcome Vera, of course we do, we must also be realistic about compatibility." I felt the eyes on me, dozens of them, watching to see how I'd react. Training kicked in. The same training that had gotten me through hostile depositions and aggressive cross-examinations. Keep your face neutral. Don't give them the reaction they're looking for. Breathe. Some people, Lorraine continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, come from backgrounds that simply don't prepare them for the responsibilities of being a Pembroke. They have different priorities. Different values. She looked directly at me now, not even pretending to address the crowd anymore. Which brings me to the real reason I wanted to speak today. Howard and I have been discussing the future, discussing what's best for this family and for our grandchild. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. My forensic accountant brain recognized it immediately from the weight of the paper, the way it had been trifolded. Legal paperwork. "We've consulted with our attorneys," Lorraine said, "and we've decided that certain protections need to be put in place." Derek stood up. "Mom, what are you doing?" His voice was strained, caught between confusion and growing anger. Lorraine ignored him. She unfolded the document and held it up like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "This is a trust agreement," she announced. "Howard and I are establishing a fund for our grandson. A substantial fund that will ensure he has every advantage, the best schools, the best opportunities." She paused for effect. "But there are conditions." The garden had gone completely silent except for the fountain's oblivious burbling and the string quartet, who seemed unsure whether to keep playing or stop. They chose to stop. In the silence, Lorraine's next words rang out with perfect clarity. "The fund will be managed by trustees appointed by Howard and myself. The money will be used for Julian's benefit alone, released according to strict guidelines we've established. And most importantly, she looked directly at me, her eyes hard as stones, the money will be completely protected from anyone who might try to access it for their own purposes. She took a step toward me, still holding the document. Because we know there are people who see this family as an opportunity. People who marry into wealth thinking they've found an easy path. People who might even get pregnant thinking it secures their position. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Around us, guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. A glass clinked against a table. I stayed seated, my hands resting on my belly where Julian was doing his afternoon gymnastics routine. I focused on that, on his movements, on the reality of him rather than the unreality of what was happening. Lorraine moved closer, standing directly in front of me now. She pointed at my pregnant belly, her finger aimed like a weapon. "That baby," she said, her voice rising, projecting to ensure every guest could hear, "will never see a penny without our approval. Not for Vera's shopping sprees, not for her career ambitions, not for whatever she thinks she's entitled to for carrying a Pembroke heir." The garden erupted in whispers. Derek was saying something, his voice loud and angry, but it sounded far away. Howard had stood up, looking confused and uncomfortable. Celeste, who'd flown in from Seattle, had her hand over her mouth. But I just sat there, looking up at Lorraine Pembroke, at this woman who'd spent months making small cuts, and had finally decided to stab. She thought she'd cornered me. She thought pregnancy made me vulnerable. She thought I was here for the money, that I'd trapped her son, that I was exactly the kind of person who'd prove her right by reacting badly to this public humiliation. What she didn't know was that while she'd been planning this performance, I'd been building a case. Not against her, I hadn't known I'd need to, but against people very much like her. People who thought their wealth made them untouchable. And I'd gotten very good at showing people they were wrong about that. I reached down beside my chair where I'd set my bag earlier. A leather portfolio, simple and professional, the kind I carried to depositions. I'd brought it without really thinking about why, just habit, always having my work close. But now I understood. Sometimes your training knows what you need before you do. I stood up slowly, carefully, one hand on my belly. The movement silenced the whispers. Everyone waited to see what I would do. Would I cry? Would I leave in shame? Would I prove Lorraine right by losing control? I met her eyes, and I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one, the kind you give someone when you know something they don't. Then I opened the portfolio. The portfolio contained something I hadn't planned to show anyone yet, something Glenn and I had been compiling for the past week after I'd recused myself from the case. He'd promised to handle it delicately, to verify everything before taking any action. But here, now, with Lorraine's finger still pointed at my belly and her accusations hanging in the air like poison gas, delicate felt less important than decisive. Inside were copies. Always copies, never originals. That was Rule 1 of evidence handling. Bank statements from 6 different accounts, all connected to Pembroke Holdings LLC. Wire transfer records showing money moving in patterns that spelled laundering in a language I'd learned to read fluently. Corporate filings that listed Howard Pembroke as not just registered agent but managing member, signatory, the person whose name appeared on documents authorizing transactions. And most damning, email correspondence that Glenn had obtained through legal subpoena just 2 days ago, showing that Howard had been actively involved in approving transfers he had to have known were suspicious. I didn't take out all of it. That would have been reckless, potentially illegal depending on how you interpreted disclosure laws. But I took out 1 page, a single wire transfer authorization from 3 months ago. Howard's signature at the bottom, clear and unmistakable. Above it, a transfer of $250,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands, the kind of transaction that required specific certification that it wasn't for purposes of tax evasion or money laundering. Howard had signed that certification. He'd sworn, legally, that the money was legitimate. I held the page up, not to the crowd, just to Lorraine. Let her see it first. Let her understand before anyone else did. Her eyes focused on the document, and I watched the exact moment comprehension hit. Her face went from triumphant to confused to pale in the span of 3 seconds. She knew her husband's signature. She'd probably seen it on hundreds of documents over the years. And she was smart enough to recognize what this particular document implied. "You want to talk about family assets," I said quietly, my voice steady despite my heart hammering against my ribs. "Let's talk about them. Let's talk about where they came from and where they've been going." I tilted the page so Derek could see it too. He leaned in, squinting at the text, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to recognition to something that looked like his whole world tilting sideways. Howard had stood up from his chair, his face losing color. "Vera, I don't think this is the appropriate venue," he started, but I cut him off with a look. I'd spent years in conference rooms with men who thought they could talk their way out of documented evidence. The look I gave Howard was the same one I gave them. It said, "The numbers don't negotiate." "You're right," I said, still speaking quietly but letting my voice carry the way I'd learned to in depositions. "This isn't appropriate. None of this is appropriate. But your wife just accused me, in front of 75 witnesses, of being a gold digger who got pregnant to access your family's money. So let's examine that family money, shall we?" I turned to address the assembled guests, many of whom had gone very still, sensing that the entertainment had shifted from social drama to something considerably more serious. "My name is Vera Castellanos," I said, and it felt important somehow to use my full name, my mother's name, the name that connected me to women who'd crossed borders with nothing but determination. "I'm a forensic accountant. I specialize in financial fraud investigation. And for the past 3 months, I've been working on a case involving money laundering through commercial real estate development." I paused, let that settle. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Those who were paying attention knew where this was going. "I was removed from the case," I continued, "when I discovered that one of the shell companies involved was registered to my father-in-law. Professional ethics required that I recuse myself to avoid conflict of interest. But the investigation didn't stop. It continued under my supervisor's direction. And what that investigation has found is evidence of systematic financial fraud involving approximately $12 million over the past 4 years. The garden erupted. Not in whispers this time but in actual exclamations. Someone gasped. A woman near the back said, "Oh my God," loud enough to hear clearly. Lorraine had gone from pale to gray, the kind of color that suggested shock or the onset of something medical. Howard sat back down heavily in his chair, his hand going to his chest. Derek was staring at me like I'd started speaking a language he didn't recognize. "Dad?" Derek's voice cracked on the word. He looked from me to his father and back again. "What is she talking about?" Howard opened his mouth but nothing came out. He tried again. "It's complicated, son. There are explanations. Business arrangements that look one way on paper but are actually perfectly legitimate." It was the wrong thing to say. I'd heard variations of that speech dozens of times. It was what guilty people said when they were buying time to construct a better defense. Tanya had moved closer, her trial attorney instincts activated. She knew exactly what was happening, had probably seen enough financial fraud cases to recognize the pattern. She positioned herself slightly behind me, a physical show of support that felt like a hand on my back. Glenn would be furious when he found out I'd done this, revealed evidence at a baby shower of all places. But Glenn hadn't been standing here watching Lorraine point at my pregnant belly like it was evidence of my moral failure. "Mrs. Pembroke," I said, turning back to Lorraine, "you wanted to establish protections for your grandson. I respect that. But perhaps you should have been more concerned about protecting him from the legal consequences of his grandfather's actions. Because when this case goes to trial, and it will, the Pembroke name is going to be attached to some very ugly charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Money laundering. Possibly racketeering depending on what else the investigation uncovers." Lorraine found her voice, though it came out thin and strained. "You're bluffing. You're trying to embarrass us because I called you out." She looked around at her guests, appealing to them. "This is retaliation. She's angry because I had the courage to say what everyone was thinking. But the crowd wasn't with her anymore. You could feel the shift. These were people who attended charity galas and served on non-profit boards. They might have tolerated social cruelty, but actual crime, documented crime, was different. That had consequences that could touch them too. I'm not bluffing, I said. And I'm not embarrassed. I came from nothing, Mrs. Pembroke. My mother worked in a processing plant. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment where the carpet had given up trying to be any particular color. Every dollar was documented in spiral notebooks because when you have nothing, you count everything. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's survival. That's precision. That's the training that makes me good at finding money that people have tried very hard to hide. I looked at Derek, who stood frozen between his parents and me, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the universe. I didn't marry you for money, I said directly to him, needing him to hear this, to understand. I married you because you were kind. Because you listened. Because you treated me like I was valuable beyond what I could provide. I got pregnant because we decided together to start a family. And I've spent the last 3 months keeping a secret that's been eating me alive because I didn't want to hurt you with information about your father until we were absolutely certain. But I'm done being quiet, I continued, my voice stronger now. I'm done pretending that kindness means accepting disrespect. I'm done letting people make assumptions about who I am based on where I came from. My mother taught me that if you can count it, you can control it. Well, I've been counting. And the numbers tell a story that your mother needs to hear. I turned back to Lorraine, who looked like she wanted to interrupt but couldn't quite find the words. You thought I wanted your money. You thought I was here to take something from your family. But I don't need your money, Mrs. Pembroke. I have my own career, my own income, my own savings that I've built from nothing. What I wanted was to be treated with basic human respect. To be welcomed into a family instead of inspected like a suspicious purchase. To have my child's grandmother look at him with love instead of viewing him as a security risk. The document was still in my hand, Howard's signature visible to anyone close enough to see. This investigation is going to proceed regardless of what happens in this garden today, I said. The evidence has been documented. Subpoenas have been issued. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be involved because some of the transactions crossed state lines and involved offshore accounts. That's federal jurisdiction. That means federal charges. Howard made a sound, something between a groan and a protest. Celeste had moved to stand near her father, her face stricken. She'd flown in from Seattle for a baby shower and walked into the disintegration of her family's reputation. I felt a moment of guilt for that, for dragging everyone into this. But then I remembered Lorraine's finger pointed at my belly, her voice declaring that my child would never see a penny, and the guilt evaporated. However, I said, and the word hung there with weight, there are some things that could potentially affect sentencing if this goes to trial. Cooperation, for instance. Full disclosure. Returning the money that was illegally obtained. The federal government looks more favorably on defendants who attempt to make restitution. I let that information sit for a moment. I wasn't offering a deal, I couldn't, I wasn't a prosecutor. But I was providing information about how the system worked. What I did with that information was up to them. Derek finally moved. He walked past his mother without looking at her, past his father, and came to stand beside me. His hand found mine, shaking slightly. Is it true? He asked quietly. All of it? My dad is actually involved in fraud? I squeezed his hand. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. I wanted to be wrong. I spent days hoping I'd made a mistake, that there was some explanation that would make it all innocent. But the evidence is clear. Glenn confirmed it. I'm so sorry. He nodded slowly, processing. Then he turned to look at his father. Dad? The question contained everything. A lifetime of trust, of believing his father was the good parent, the reasonable one, the one who tried to buffer him from his mother's harshness. Howard couldn't meet his son's eyes. That alone was answer enough. Lorraine had recovered some of her composure, or at least her anger. You had no right, she hissed at me. To bring this here, to our home, to humiliate us in front of our friends. I almost laughed. The absurdity of her standing there, after what she'd done, accusing me of humiliation. I didn't bring this here, I said. You did. You're the one who decided a baby shower was the appropriate venue for public accusations. You're the one who pointed at my pregnant belly and declared that my son would never benefit from your family's wealth. You made this public. I just provided context. Arthur, the family's longtime butler, had appeared at the edge of the garden, his face carefully neutral but his presence suggesting that someone, probably him, had called for assistance of some kind. Behind him, I could see 2 other staff members hovering uncertainly. The party was over. That much was obvious. The question was how it would end. Howard stood up, his movements slow and effortful. He looked older than he had an hour ago, as if the accusations had aged him in real time. I think, he said, his voice rough, that we should move this conversation inside. Away from guests. It was the first sensible thing anyone had said since Lorraine had started her speech. Tanya touched my elbow. Want me to come with you? She asked quietly. I shook my head. This is family business now. But thank you. For being here. For standing with me. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my belly, and whispered in my ear, "You're the bravest person I know. Call me later." Then she stepped back, collected her bag, and made her way toward the exit. Several other guests took that as their cue to leave. The exodus happened quickly, people suddenly remembering urgent appointments, previous commitments, anywhere they needed to be that wasn't here watching the Pembroke family implode. Within 15 minutes, the garden had cleared except for immediate family. Derek and me. Howard and Lorraine. Celeste and her husband Preston, who'd been so quiet throughout the whole thing I'd almost forgotten he was there. And Arthur, still hovering at a respectful distance, ready to assist with whatever aftermath needed managing. We moved inside to Howard's study, a wood-paneled room lined with law books and family photographs that now felt ironic. How many of those photos had been taken with money that wasn't legitimately earned? Howard sat behind his desk, the position of power, but he looked anything but powerful. Lorraine stood by the window, her back to the room, rigid with anger or shock or both. Celeste and Preston took one of the leather couches. Derek and I stood, neither of us quite ready to sit, to settle into this new reality. The document was still in my hand. I set it on Howard's desk, letting him look at his own signature. "How long have you known?" Derek asked me, his voice hollow. "About a week that it was definitely your father. 3 months that something was wrong with the case." He absorbed that, the timeline of my knowledge versus my silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself. "Because I wanted to be wrong," I said. "Because telling you meant making it real. Because I know what it's like to lose a parent and I didn't want to be the one who cost you yours." "But you were fine being the one to announce it at a baby shower," Lorraine said without turning around, her voice dripping with bitterness. I met Derek's eyes before answering his mother. "I wasn't planning to announce anything today. I brought the portfolio because it's habit, because I carry my work with me. But when your mother pointed at my belly and accused me of getting pregnant for money, when she announced to 75 people that my son would never benefit from this family, something shifted. I realized I was done protecting people who wouldn't protect me." Howard picked up the document, staring at his own signature like it belonged to someone else. "It started small," he said quietly. "A favor for a business associate. He needed a registered agent for a company, someone with a good reputation in the community. I didn't think much of it. Then he asked if I'd be willing to sign some paperwork, just formalities, he said, standard corporate governance. I trusted him. We'd done business together for years. When did you realize it wasn't legitimate?" I asked, the accountant in me needing the timeline. He was quiet for a long moment. "Last year," he finally said. "Maybe earlier if I'm honest. There were transactions that didn't make sense. Amounts that were too round, too convenient. But by then I was in too deep. He had my signature on dozens of documents. He said if I tried to back out, he'd make sure I looked like a willing participant. It was a classic pattern. Start with something small and seemingly innocent, then gradually increase the stakes until the person was so entangled they felt they had no choice but to continue. I'd seen it in probably a third of the fraud cases I'd worked. So you just kept signing, I said, not quite a question. Howard nodded miserably. I thought I could fix it quietly. Unwind my involvement without anyone noticing. I didn't know there was an investigation. There's always an investigation eventually, I said. Money doesn't vanish. It just moves. And if you know how to look, you can always find the trail. Celeste had been sitting very still, her hands clasped in her lap. What happens now? She asked. It was directed at me, as if I were the authority on family implosion. Maybe I was. Now, I said, Howard needs a criminal defense attorney. A good one. Someone who specializes in white-collar crime and has relationships with federal prosecutors. Are you going to press this? Howard asked, looking at me with something that might have been hope. Are you going to push for charges? I shook my head. That's not my choice. I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not even on the case anymore. Glenn is handling it now, and he'll do what the evidence requires. But Howard, you need to understand something. This isn't going away. The investigation is too far along. Too many agencies are involved. Your best option now is cooperation. Full cooperation. Tell them everything. Help them find the money. Make restitution where possible. That's the only path that doesn't end with significant prison time. Prison. The word landed in the room like something physical. Lorraine made a small sound, still facing the window. Derek's hand tightened around mine. Celeste looked at her father with an expression that contained equal parts pity and anger. Preston checked his phone, probably already calculating the distance he needed to maintain from this scandal for his own career protection. I'll make some calls, Derek said suddenly. I know someone from college, his dad is a defense attorney in Seattle. Does high-level corporate stuff. I'll see if he can recommend someone. It was something to do, action in the face of overwhelming information, and Howard nodded gratefully at his son. The dynamic had shifted so completely. An hour ago, Howard had been the patriarch, the steady presence while Lorraine created drama. Now he was the one who needed protection, and Derek had stepped into the role of problem solver. I felt Julian kick, a strong jab to my ribs that almost made me gasp. My hand went to the spot automatically. Derek noticed, his attention shifting immediately. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? His concern was genuine, cutting through everything else. We're fine, I said. He's just reminding me he's in here. Probably picking up on my stress. Derek's hand joined mine on my belly, feeling for movement. For a moment, we were just two people about to become parents, the simplest and most profound thing in the room. Lorraine finally turned from the window. She looked diminished somehow, smaller than she'd been in the garden. I owe you an apology, she said, and the words clearly cost her. What I said about the baby, about you. It was cruel and unfounded. It wasn't quite an apology for a lifetime of small cuts and pointed observations, but it was something. I nodded, accepting what she could give. I need to leave, I said to Derek. I need to go home. This has been too much. He nodded immediately. I'll drive you. He turned to his family. We'll talk more tomorrow. After everyone has had time to process. Howard stood, looking like he wanted to say something, find words that would make this better. But there were no words. He'd put his name on documents he shouldn't have. The consequences were coming regardless of what anyone said in this room. Derek and I walked out through the house, past the photographs and the expensive furniture and the symbols of wealth that suddenly felt tainted. The garden was being cleaned up by staff, tables cleared, decorations removed, the evidence of the party vanishing as if it had never happened. But it had happened. Everything had happened. And there was no cleaning up what had been revealed. In the car, Derek drove in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Did you mean it? What you said about marrying me?" His voice was small, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. I reached over and took his hand. "Every word. I love you, Derek. I loved you before I knew your last name had weight. I love you for who you are, not what your family has. And I'm sorry that my job led to this. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." He pulled over into a parking lot, a random strip mall, and put the car in park. Then he turned to me, his eyes red. "My whole life, I thought my dad was the good one. The reasonable parent. The one who balanced my mom out. And now I find out he's been committing fraud for years. How do I reconcile that? How do I look at him and not see a stranger?" I didn't have an answer. People contained multitudes. They could be good fathers and still make catastrophic choices. They could love their families and still prioritize self-preservation. "You take it one day at a time," I said finally. "You figure out what you can forgive and what you can't. You decide what kind of relationship is possible going forward. But Derek, you don't have to decide any of that today. Today you just need to breathe and get through it." He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he leaned over, carefully mindful of my belly, and kissed my forehead. "Thank you for standing up for yourself," he said. "For standing up for Jules. My mother had that coming for a long time." We drove the rest of the way home in companionable silence. When we got to the house, Derek insisted on making me tea and heating up leftover soup. He hovered, needing to take care of something he could control when everything else felt chaotic. I let him. Sometimes love looked like someone making you soup when the world was falling apart. I sat at our kitchen table, my hand on my belly where Julian continued his gymnastics, and I thought about my mother's spiral notebooks. "If you can count it, you can control it," she'd written. I'd counted. I'd documented. I'd controlled the only things I could, which were my own actions and my own voice. The rest would unfold according to rules I understood: evidence, law, consequences. The numbers would tell their truth, the way they always did eventually. And I would be here, growing a baby and building a life, regardless of what happened to the Pembroke family fortune. Because I'd never needed their money. I'd only ever needed their respect. And if I couldn't have that, then I'd settle for their understanding that I was not someone to be underestimated. The days that followed the baby shower moved with the strange dual quality of being both impossibly slow and frighteningly fast. Hours stretched like taffy when I sat alone in our house, feeling Julian move inside me while Derek was at his parents' estate trying to help his father navigate the legal disaster. But then entire days would vanish in what felt like minutes, swallowed by phone calls with Glenn, meetings with prosecutors, the machinery of justice grinding forward with its own relentless momentum. Howard hired the attorney Derek's college friend had recommended, a sharp-eyed woman from Seattle named Diane Rothstein who specialized in federal white-collar defense. She had the kind of reputation that preceded her, the type of lawyer prosecutors respected even when they were on opposite sides. Within 48 hours of being retained, she'd arranged a proffer session, the legal term for the meeting where a defendant tells prosecutors everything they know in exchange for potential consideration during sentencing. Glenn called me the day after that session, his voice careful. "Howard gave them everything," he said. "Names, account numbers, transaction dates. The whole network. He's been cooperating for 12 hours straight." I sat on our back porch, watching Derek's unfinished garden project, beds he'd dug but not yet planted. "Is it enough?" I asked. Glenn was quiet for a moment. "It's substantial. Whether it's enough depends on how much responsibility the prosecutors think he bears. He wasn't the mastermind, but he was more than just a name on paper. He facilitated. That has weight." The scandal spread through Ashford Heights the way fire spreads through dry grass, quick and consuming. By the end of the first week, the story had made the local news. By the second week, the financial press had picked it up because one of the other people Howard had implicated was a regional bank vice president whose institution had processed many of the suspicious transactions. The Pembroke name, which had opened doors for generations, now triggered uncomfortable silences. Celeste called from Seattle, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Preston's partners are concerned about association, she said, not quite managing to hide the hurt beneath the professional language. They've asked him to take a step back from client-facing work until this resolves. Translation: her husband was being sidelined because of her maiden name. I understood the impulse to blame me for that, for bringing this to light. But I hadn't created the problem. I just refused to ignore it. Derek stopped going to the estate after the first week. He'd tried, had driven there 3 mornings in a row to sit with his father, to offer support the way good sons do. But each time he'd come home looking hollowed out, the conversations with Howard chipping away at whatever foundation their relationship had rested on. He keeps apologizing, Derek told me one night, lying in bed with his hand on my belly. But it's like he's apologizing for getting caught, not for what he did. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. I'd seen it in dozens of defendants over the years. The remorse that was really regret, sorrow for consequences rather than actions. Some people can't see past their own perspective, I said. They genuinely believe they had good reasons for their choices. The complexity of those reasons feels, to them, like justification. Derek was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to be his son anymore, he finally said. Every memory feels different now. Was he lying then too? When he taught me to tie fishing knots, was he also signing fraudulent documents? When we went to baseball games, was he calculating wire transfers in his head? I didn't have answers that would make it easier. Some betrayals were too fundamental. They didn't just change the present, they retroactively altered the past, made you question everything you thought you knew. All I could offer was presence, my hand covering his on my stomach, Julian's movements beneath our palms reminding us that forward motion was still possible even when backward seemed poisoned. Lorraine handled the crisis the way she handled everything, with rigid control and careful image management. She hired a public relations consultant who issued a statement on the family's behalf expressing shock and disappointment, emphasizing Howard's cooperation with authorities, highlighting their commitment to making amends. She resigned from 2 charity boards before they could ask her to step down, a preemptive strike that let her frame it as prioritizing family during a difficult time. She called the house 3 weeks after the baby shower, the first time she'd reached out since that day in the garden. Derek answered, and I heard his side of the conversation from the kitchen. Yes, Vera was fine. Yes, the baby was fine. No, he didn't think now was the right time for a visit. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, Derek's responses getting shorter and more clipped until he finally said he had to go and hung up. He stood there for a moment, phone still in his hand, looking lost. She wants to apologize to you in person, he said. She says she's been reflecting on her behavior. I continued chopping vegetables for the stir-fry I was making, letting the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board fill the space while I thought. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let Lorraine sit with her regret the way she'd wanted me to sit with her accusations. But another part, the part that had to think about Julian and what kind of family he'd grow up in, knew that closed doors rarely led anywhere good. Tell her she can come by this weekend, I said. Saturday afternoon. She can have an hour. Derek looked surprised, maybe even relieved. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded. I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it because our son deserves grandparents who are at least trying to be better. If she's actually reflecting, actually changing, then that benefits Jules. If she's just performing, then at least we'll know. Lorraine arrived exactly on time Saturday afternoon, which shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did. Punctuality as a form of contrition. She wore simple clothes for once, slacks and a blouse instead of her usual careful coordination. No pearls. Minimal makeup. The armor stripped down to something closer to human. Derek let her in and then, at my suggestion, gave us space. This conversation needed to happen without him in the middle. We sat in the living room, afternoon light coming through the windows Derek had been so excited about when we bought the house. Lorraine perched on the edge of the chair, her posture perfect even in apparent discomfort. I sat on the couch, my feet up on the ottoman because my ankles had started swelling and the doctor had recommended elevation. Pregnancy as the great equalizer. Hard to maintain pretense when your body is staging its own rebellion. Thank you for seeing me, Lorraine began, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I wasn't sure you would. I didn't respond immediately, just waited. I'd learned in depositions that silence was often more effective than questions. People filled silence, especially when they were nervous. Lorraine filled it with honesty, or something close to it. I was wrong, she said, the words clearly difficult. What I said at the shower, the way I've treated you since Derek brought you home. I've been operating from fear disguised as protectiveness. She looked down at her hands, manicured but now absent the rings she usually wore. When Derek started dating you, when it became serious, I felt like I was losing him. Like you were taking him away from the life I'd planned for him, from the family legacy I thought he'd uphold. That's not a reason, I said, my voice level. That's an explanation. They're different things. She nodded, accepting the distinction. You're right. The reason is that I'm a snob. I've spent my entire adult life in a world where value is determined by pedigree and bank accounts and the right schools. You didn't fit the categories I understood. So instead of examining my own limitations, I tried to make you into a problem. It was more self-awareness than I'd expected from her. I shifted on the couch, trying to find a comfortable position that didn't exist anymore at 7 months pregnant. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked. It wasn't the comments about my background or the subtle digs about my clothes or my career. It was the way you looked at me like I was a threat. Like I'd done something wrong by falling in love with your son. Lorraine's eyes glistened, actual tears threatening her carefully maintained composure. I did see you as a threat. Because you represented change. The Pembroke family has been the same for so long, operating by the same rules, moving in the same circles. You were different, and different felt dangerous. But then Howard's arrest happened, and suddenly everything I thought was stable and safe turned out to be rotten underneath. And I realized that maybe the danger wasn't you. Maybe it was the world I'd been clinging to so desperately. Howard hasn't been arrested, I corrected automatically. He's been charged, but he's out on bond pending trial. Professional habit, precision with language. Lorraine smiled slightly, sadly. See, even now, you're more informed about my husband's legal status than I am. You know what the next steps are, what the timeline looks like. Meanwhile, I've been hiding in the house trying to figure out how to show my face at the grocery store. The timeline is approximately 6 months until trial if it goes that far, I said, giving her what she hadn't asked for but probably needed. Diane is good. She'll work on a plea agreement that minimizes prison time. Howard's cooperation has value. If he continues to be forthcoming, provides testimony if needed, he's looking at maybe 2 years instead of 10. Maybe less with good behavior. Lorraine absorbed that information, visibly trying to imagine 2 years of visiting her husband in a federal facility. Will you testify? She asked. If there's a trial? I shook my head. I recused myself from the case. Glenn is the primary investigator now. He'll be the one testifying about the evidence. I might be called as a witness to establish the chain of custody for documents I initially flagged, but my role will be minimal. We sat in silence for a moment. Julian was doing what felt like somersaults, his movements visible through my shirt. Lorraine watched, her expression unreadable. May I? She asked, gesturing toward my belly. It was such a human request, stripped of all her usual formality. I nodded. She moved to sit beside me on the couch, reaching out hesitantly before placing her hand where Julian was most active. Her face changed when she felt him kick, softening in a way I'd never seen. He's strong, she said, wonder in her voice. Derek was like this too. Constant motion from about 6 months on. Drove me crazy because I couldn't sleep, but now it's one of my most vivid memories. That feeling of life moving inside you. She kept her hand there, feeling Julian's acrobatics, and something shifted in the room. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. I want to be a good grandmother, Lorraine said, still focused on my belly. I know I haven't earned that yet. I know I have to prove I can be different. But Vera, I'm asking for the chance. Not for me, for him. She looked up, meeting my eyes. He deserves to have family who loves him without conditions. Who celebrates who he is instead of trying to shape him into who they think he should be. I want to be that for him. I want to do better than I did with my own children. It was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen her, this woman who'd pointed at my pregnant belly and declared my son would never see a penny of family money. The contrast was so stark it was almost difficult to reconcile that these were the same person. But people contained contradictions. They could be cruel and capable of change. They could cause harm and later recognize it. The question was whether the recognition led to different behavior. Here's what I need from you, I said, my hand covering hers on my stomach. I need you to treat me like a person, not a problem to be managed. I need you to respect that I come from different circumstances than you and that those circumstances don't make me less than. I need you to understand that Derek chose me, and that choice deserves to be honored, not questioned. I paused, making sure she was really hearing me. And I need you to never, ever make our son feel like he has to choose between parts of his heritage. He's going to be half Castellanos and half Pembroke. Both of those matter equally. Lorraine nodded, tears actually falling now. I can do that. I will do that. She hesitated, then asked, can you forgive me? For the shower, for everything before it? I thought about my mother's spiral notebooks, about the careful accounting of every dollar. Forgiveness was like that too, something you had to track, had to consciously choose to allocate. It couldn't be given blindly or all at once. I can work toward forgiveness, I said honestly. I can see your effort and acknowledge it. I can let you build a relationship with Julian and see how you handle that responsibility. But Lorraine, trust is earned back slowly. It's earned by consistent behavior over time, not by one good conversation. She accepted that, nodding. That's fair. That's more than fair. She wiped her eyes, careful not to smudge what was left of her mascara. Thank you for giving me the chance. Derek appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by some sixth sense that the conversation had reached a natural conclusion. He looked at his mother, at her hands still resting on my belly, at the tear tracks on her cheeks, and his expression was complicated. Relief and wariness and hope all mixed together. Everything okay? He asked carefully. We're getting there, I said. Your mom was just meeting her grandson. Lorraine stood, smoothing her clothes in a gesture that was pure habit, armor going back on. But something had shifted. She kissed Derek's cheek on her way out, murmured something to him I couldn't quite hear. At the door, she turned back. I meant what I said. I'm going to do better. Then she was gone, leaving Derek and me standing in the living room processing what had just happened. Did that really just happen? Derek asked, sinking onto the couch beside me. Did my mother just apologize and cry and ask permission to touch your stomach? I leaned into him, tired from the emotional weight of the conversation. People surprise you sometimes. Usually badly, but occasionally in the other direction. He wrapped his arm around me, his hand automatically going to my belly where his mother's had been moments before. The trial preparation consumed the next 2 months. Howard met with prosecutors repeatedly, providing details about the larger fraud network he'd been part of. Several other arrests followed his cooperation, including the regional bank vice president and the developer who'd originally pulled Howard into the scheme. The media coverage intensified, reporters occasionally showing up at the estate trying to get comments. Lorraine handled it with surprising grace, a brief statement and then silence, refusing to engage with the spectacle. I stayed as far from it as possible, focusing on the final weeks of pregnancy. Work had placed me on modified duty once I hit 8 months, no new cases, just documentation and consultation from home. My body had become a landscape of discomfort, nothing quite fitting right, sleep elusive, every position somehow wrong after 15 minutes. Julian continued his gymnastics, seemingly determined to explore every inch of available space. Derek transformed the spare room into a nursery, throwing himself into the project with an intensity that was clearly about having something he could control. He painted the walls a soft gray-blue, assembled furniture with meticulous attention to the instructions, arranged and rearranged the layout until it felt right. I watched him work, understanding that this was how he was processing everything. His father's betrayal, his mother's transformation, the approaching reality of fatherhood. The nursery was something good he could build when so much else was falling apart. Lorraine came by every week, always calling first, always staying for exactly the amount of time I'd indicated was okay. She brought gifts that were thoughtful rather than expensive, a handmade quilt from a woman she knew through her church, a set of books that had been Derek's as a child. She asked questions about how I was feeling and actually listened to the answers. She shared stories about Derek's childhood that made him groan with embarrassment but made me laugh. Slowly, incrementally, she was building something new between us. Howard I saw less. The emotional weight of facing him was something Derek struggled with, and I wasn't going to push. We had a brief conversation once when he called the house and I answered. He wanted me to know he was grateful for the care I'd shown Lorraine, for giving her the chance to repair things. You didn't have to do that, he said. After everything. I told him I'd done it for Julian, not for him. But maybe also a little bit because I'd seen genuine remorse in Lorraine's face, and that counted for something. At 38 weeks, my water broke at 3 in the morning while I was standing in the kitchen trying to decide if I wanted crackers or yogurt. The pop was unmistakable, followed by the warm rush that meant there was no more wondering if today was the day. Derek, I called, keeping my voice calm despite my heart rate spiking. It's time. He appeared within seconds, looking simultaneously terrified and excited, holding the hospital bag we'd packed 2 weeks ago just in case. Labor was long and hard and nothing like the peaceful birth story some people shared. 18 hours of contractions that felt like my body was trying to turn itself inside out. Derek never left, holding my hand through each wave, reminding me to breathe when I forgot, being exactly what I needed even when I snapped at him for suggesting things. Tanya showed up at hour 12, bringing coffee for Derek and encouragement for me, staying until the nurses said it was family only for the final pushing stage. Julian Castellanos Pembroke entered the world at 9:47 in the evening, screaming his objection to the cold air and bright lights. 7 pounds 6 ounces of furious, perfect humanity. They placed him on my chest immediately, his tiny face scrunched with outrage, and I felt something in my chest crack open. This was my son. This was the person I'd been growing, the reason Lorraine had pointed at my belly with such disdain, the future we'd been protecting with all our various forms of truth-telling. Derek cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. He's perfect, he kept saying. He's absolutely perfect. The nurses did their measurements and assessments, pronouncing everything healthy and normal. Julian had dark hair like mine and Derek's mouth and fingers that grasped at air like he was already trying to hold on to something. I counted his toes, his fingers, catalogued every detail the way my mother had taught me to catalog important things. We called family from the hospital room once we were moved from delivery to recovery. Tanya came back with food and flowers and hugged both of us with fierce joy. Glenn sent a message through his assistant, congratulations, and an offer to handle anything work-related until I was ready to return. Celeste called from Seattle, her voice warm with genuine happiness for us, asking when she could visit to meet her nephew. Lorraine and Howard arrived together the next morning, both of them looking nervous in a way I'd never seen from either of them. Lorraine held a small bag, Howard carried flowers. Derek let them in, and I watched Howard's face when he saw Julian for the first time, sleeping in the hospital bassinet beside my bed. His expression crumpled, joy and grief and regret all visible at once. This was his grandson, but he'd be in federal prison for part of the child's early years. He'd miss milestones because of choices he'd made. Can I hold him? Lorraine asked softly, and I nodded. Derek lifted Julian carefully, placed him in his mother's arms. She looked down at her grandson with such tenderness, such complete focus, that it was like watching someone fall in love in real time. "Hello, Julian," she whispered. "I'm your grandmother. I'm going to try very hard to be worthy of you." Howard stood beside his wife, one hand on her shoulder, the other reaching out to touch Julian's tiny fist. Neither of them said anything about money or trusts or inheritance. They just stood there being grandparents, being human in their wonder at new life. After 20 minutes, Lorraine carefully handed Julian back to me. "Thank you," she said simply. "For letting us be here. For this." She gathered her things to leave, understanding without being told that we needed rest. At the door, she turned back. "Vera, I just want you to know. You were right about everything. At the shower, everything you said. I was wrong. And I'm sorry it took so long for me to understand that." When they left, Derek climbed carefully onto the hospital bed beside me, the two of us creating a protective circle around Julian. "Your mom has really changed," I said softly. Derek nodded against my shoulder. "I think almost losing everything made her reevaluate what actually mattered. Turns out it wasn't the country club or the charitable boards or the carefully maintained image. It was this." He touched Julian's hand, the tiny fingers wrapping reflexively around his thumb. "We stayed in the hospital for 2 days, learning how to diaper and swaddle and interpret the different types of crying. The lactation consultant visited 3 times, patient with my fumbling attempts at feeding. The pediatrician pronounced Julian healthy and cleared us for discharge. On the drive home, Derek drove 5 miles under the speed limit, treating every bump like it might shatter something precious. The house felt different with Julian in it, fuller somehow despite him being so small. We moved through those first weeks in a fog of exhaustion and wonder, taking turns with night feedings, learning his patterns, falling more in love every day. Tanya brought meals. Lorraine came by to help with laundry and hold Julian so I could shower. Even Celeste flew down for a weekend, eager to meet her nephew and surprisingly helpful with her prior experience as a mother. Howard's sentencing happened when Julian was 6 weeks old. 2 years in a minimum security federal facility, 3 years supervised release afterward, and full restitution of the money he'd helped launder. It could have been worse. Diane had argued successfully that his cooperation had been substantial and genuine, that he'd demonstrated remorse, that he had family who needed him. The judge had been tough but not merciless. Derek went to the sentencing. I stayed home with Julian, not wanting to bring a baby to a courtroom. When Derek returned, he looked exhausted, older somehow. He cried when the judge pronounced the sentence, Derek said, sitting heavily on the couch. My dad actually cried in court. I sat beside him, Julian asleep in my arms. He's scared, I said. That's human. Derek nodded, leaning his head against my shoulder. The judge said something at the end. About how white-collar crime has real victims, real consequences. About how people in positions of privilege have a responsibility to do better. It was like she was talking directly to him. Maybe she was, I said. Judges see a lot of people make a lot of mistakes. Sometimes they hope their words will mean something, will change something. Derek was quiet for a moment. Do you think he'll actually change? Or will he just serve his time and come out the same person? It was a question I couldn't answer. Some people transformed through consequence. Others just learned to hide better. Time would tell which kind Howard was. Julian's first birthday party was held in our backyard, simple and joyful in ways the baby shower had never been. Paper lanterns hung from the trees Derek had finally planted. A small cake with blue frosting sat on a table covered in a plastic tablecloth. The guest list was deliberately small, people who actually cared about Julian rather than people we felt obligated to invite. Tanya came with her new girlfriend, both of them taking turns making Julian laugh with exaggerated faces. Glenn brought his wife and their teenage daughter, who was surprisingly patient with a 1-year-old's grabby hands. Celeste flew in from Seattle with her 2 kids, cousins meeting for the first time. And Lorraine came alone, Howard still having 8 months left on his sentence. She'd visited him every week without fail, making the drive to the facility where he was housed. She told me once that the visits were hard, seeing him in prison clothes, talking through phones with glass between them. But she went anyway, because that was what commitment looked like when the easy parts were stripped away. I respected that, the way she'd chosen to stand by him even when walking away would have been simpler. Julian took his first steps at that party, letting go of the coffee table and wobbling 3 steps toward Derek before sitting down hard on his diaper-padded bottom. Everyone cheered like he'd done something miraculous, which in a way he had. First steps were always miraculous, the beginning of independence, the start of a child moving through the world on their own power. Lorraine cried watching him, tears she didn't try to hide. "Howard is going to be devastated he missed this," she said. I'd started recording videos for her to show Howard during visits, little moments he was missing. Julian's first solid food, the way he'd learned to clap, his fascination with our neighbor's cat. It wasn't the same as being there, but it was something. A thread of connection maintained despite concrete walls and visiting schedules. The business with the fraud case had mostly resolved. Several people had gone to trial and been convicted. Others, like Howard, had taken plea deals. The money had been traced and, where possible, returned to the investors who'd been defrauded. Glenn had received recognition from the federal prosecutors for the quality of his investigation. He'd made sure to credit my initial work, the flags I'd raised that started the whole thing, though I'd asked him to keep my name out of any press coverage. I'd gone back to work when Julian was 4 months old, part-time at first, then gradually increasing my hours as we found a rhythm with childcare. Lorraine had offered to watch Julian 2 days a week, an offer I'd accepted after careful consideration. She was good with him, patient and attentive in ways I imagined she might not have been with her own children when the pressure of maintaining appearances had been stronger. Derek's landscape architecture firm had actually grown during everything. People respected that he'd kept working, kept designing beautiful spaces, while his family imploded around him. There was something appealing about someone who didn't fall apart, who kept building when demolition seemed easier. He'd landed a major contract to redesign a city park, his biggest project yet. We'd found our footing, the 3 of us. Mornings were chaotic with Julian's boundless energy and questionable opinions about getting dressed. Evenings were peaceful once he was asleep, Derek and I finally having time to talk without interruption. We'd started going on actual dates again, Lorraine or Tanya watching Julian while we remembered what it felt like to just be 2 people who loved each other. The second baby shower, the one Tanya threw for me when I got pregnant again 2 years later, was everything the first one wasn't. Held in Tanya's apartment with mismatched plates and a cake from the grocery store. Friends from work, neighbors, people who knew me as Vera and not as Derek Pembroke's wife or Howard Pembroke's daughter-in-law. When someone asked if the Pembroke family was contributing to this baby's future, Tanya shut it down immediately. "Vera doesn't need anyone's money," she said firmly. "She's built her own security." And it was true. I'd been promoted at work, leading the fraud examination division now. My salary was substantial, my reputation solid. I'd started teaching a class at the community college, Forensic Accounting Fundamentals, sharing what I knew with students who reminded me of myself at that age. Young people who came from nothing but had the precision and stubbornness to make something of themselves. Howard came home on a Tuesday in October when Julian was 2.5. Derek picked him up from the facility, and they went for coffee before coming to the house. I watched from the window as they sat in Derek's truck in the driveway for 20 minutes, talking about things I'd never know. When they finally came inside, Howard looked smaller somehow, humbled in a way that seemed genuine. He knelt down to Julian's level, this grandfather meeting his grandson properly for the first time outside prison visiting rooms. "Hi there," he said softly. Julian, who'd been coached by Derek and me about Grandpa coming home, offered one of his toy trucks. It was the kind of gift toddlers give, the most valuable thing they own in that moment. Howard took it with shaking hands and said thank you like he meant it. Recovery wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. Howard struggled with the supervised release conditions, with finding meaningful work when his reputation was permanently marked. But he showed up to Julian's 3rd birthday, to family dinners, to the small moments that built trust back molecule by molecule. Lorraine stood beside him through it, their marriage transformed by crisis into something neither of them had expected but both seemed committed to maintaining. The greatest revenge, I'd learned, wasn't humiliation or exposure. It was building a life so complete that the opinions of people who'd underestimated you became irrelevant. I had my work, challenging and respected. I had Derek, who'd chosen me over and over, including when that choice was hardest. I had Julian and soon another baby, children who would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage mattered equally. And I had my mother's spiral notebooks, still on my shelf, reminding me that precision wasn't just about counting money. It was about counting what mattered, allocating your energy and forgiveness and trust with the same careful attention you'd give any valuable resource. Some people earned more of those things than others. That wasn't cruel, it was honest. And honesty, I discovered, was the foundation everything else had to be built on. Lorraine never pointed at my belly again during my second pregnancy. Instead, she asked permission to feel the baby kick, thanked me for the privilege, and told her friends that her daughter-in-law was brilliant and accomplished and that their family was lucky to have me. It was the bare minimum of respect, really. But when you've lived without it, the bare minimum can feel revolutionary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.